Hey everyone, we are back for day 3, and we've covered the most widely known countries, which are Afghanistan and Iraq. But Will Porter joins me again today to discuss Syria, which is a country he knows a great deal about. Syria has been at war since 2012, and nearly 500,000 people have perished in the conflict there. The country is racked by internal divisions and foreign interventionism, and today we're going to try to sort some of this out. Thanks everyone for the kind words, and this whole week will be remembered as something special. Enjoy the show. The Peace Liberty Podcast, episode 18. All right, Will, thanks for coming back on, man.
Hey, I appreciate you having me back on anytime.
So we're bumping up your mic for this video. If anyone's listening to yesterday's episode, had a little bit of a mic difficulty, and so today should sound a little bit better. But we're going to be talking about Syria today, and Syria is a little bit of a unknown country to most people. And you can remember Gary Johnson's famous line, "What is Aleppo?" Start us off, Will. I think a lot of this starts off with Bashar al-Assad and the chemical weapons accusations. And where does it start?
Yeah, I guess I could give a little bit of historical background just to kind of paint the picture with like the politics of the country, I guess. And so Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, but his father actually came before him. He's kind of part of a political dynasty. So his father was named Hafez al-Assad, and he ruled for 30 years from 1971 till Bashar came in 2000. However, Hafez al-Assad really had a lot of problems with certain political groupings in Syria, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a Sunni group. Religious group, obviously. And so one particular incident in, I think it was 1982, called the Hama Massacre. This is like a major point in Syrian history. And a lot of, I think, even current political activists in Syria on the Sunni side will refer to this. You know, they think back to this Hama Massacre. And so this is where there was basically a Muslim Brotherhood uprising, and the Syrian army put them down violently. And it's estimated anywhere between 2,000 and 40,000 people were killed. I'm not really sure whose estimate to trust there, but the highest end is 40,000 people. And so that just kind of paints the picture of like the politics of the country. There's been strife that goes back well before Bashar al-Assad. But getting more to the present, Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000. Now he's had an on and off friendly and hostile relationship with the United States. And so sort of like in 2002, I think John Bolton, the guy who's been just named as Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton listed Syria as part of this broader axis of evil. George W. Bush had this axis of evil that he called, he included Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, strangely. However, John Bolton included Syria as part of this broader axis of evil too. And so that kind of shows you that there's been sort of a mixed relationship. After that, though, Assad worked with the U.S. government just fine in its extraordinary rendition program, where we sent terror suspects to Assad to be tortured and stuff. And so I'm just kind of laying out like the mixed relationship the U.S. has had with Assad.
No, this is good.
Starting what you really want to talk about, I think, is the Syrian civil war. And that sort of, that started in 2011 about. I think the real fighting got going in 2012, but like the protest movements and stuff really got going in 2011. And so, yeah, that basically started, it was an anti-corruption protest. It was kind of on the heels of the Arab Spring movements in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya. And we had just sort of NATO had overthrown Muammar Gaddafi in Libya just as the Syrian protests were getting going.
Now, was that beginning? That was the beginning of 2011? Was that around like March, I believe?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. So the protests, though, often something you'll hear about, like just the general narrative about the protests against the Assad regime was that it was purely peaceful and that Assad just overreacted and gunned down all these people. And I think in some cases that's probably true, but there's also there's eyewitness testimony of rebels and protesters very early on bringing guns to protests and shooting at security forces and stuff. And so it's not exactly clear. Like you'll often hear the narrative that Assad just purely is to blame and he started all this. That's not so clear. It seems it's sort of mixed in regards to that.
And just to clarify once more, the claim is often said that Assad is the one that's, he's in charge of these attacks, but really it's these anti-Assad people that are oftentimes doing these shootings.
Yeah. So like Assad, certainly, I would not seek to defend his actions in this war. He's certainly killed a lot of civilians.
Sure.
But just the way he's presented is it's just purely this one-sided war where this dictator is slaughtering civilians. I mean, if you go look at the actual civilian casualty numbers, the Syrian Arab army has also lost like 200,000 people. And so this is a real, like, it's a very violent conflict, but it's certainly not one-sided. And so
Now,
just to
oh,
clear
yeah.
that up.
Gotcha. Yeah, that does clear that up. And how did this lead up to the Free Syrian Army and the supposed release of the jihadi prisoners in July 2011?
Yeah, so this is pretty early on in the protest movement when rebels were basically demanding that Assad release certain activists and certain people, certain figureheads from prison. And he did indeed go and do that. Of course, critics then turn around and blame him and say that, oh, he actually released a bunch of jihadists on purpose to sort of discredit the opposition and stuff. But I don't think that was necessary. You brought up the Free Syrian Army, and there's plenty of, I think one of the, I forget the guy's name now, off the top of my head, I can't bring it, but a leader of the Free Syrian Army was caught on tape eating the heart of a dead soldier. And so this is not a moderate group here. We're talking about very cutthroat kind of people. You didn't need Assad to release jihadists from prison to make it a brutal cutthroat movement.
Wow. Well, so continuing on from there, I guess there was just so much devastation in that country. All of 2011, like, it just became a hellhole. And so I think in 2012, the Syrian Kurds seceded from Assad's rule. How did that happen?
Yeah, perhaps it's better just to go back a little bit, because around 2012, this is about when the real hostilities broke out. Before we were talking about protests, and by 2012, we're really talking about a civil war in the country. And so there's actually a DIA, a Defense Intelligence Agency document that's the Pentagon's sort of intelligence wing from 2012 that says that it's basically laying out the American position on Syria. And this document points out that the Sunni opposition, the rebel movement in Syria, is dominated by jihadists. This is like, they say this in no uncertain terms.
Can we link to this document, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely. A great journalist named Brad Hoff reported about this at a place called the Levant Report. I think Judicial Watch initially published the documents, but Brad Hoff really did the work at confirming it and following up with the DIA and stuff. And so what this document basically says is that the Syrian opposition is full of radicals, and to the extent that there's even a risk that what they called a Salafist principality might emerge in eastern Syria. And those words, Salafist principality, Salafism is just like a very orthodox, sort of austere form of Islamic jurisprudence, and a principality is a state. And so effectively what they're saying is there's a risk of an Islamic state emerging in eastern Syria. However, this is exactly what the supporting powers of the opposition want. That's almost a direct quote from this document. And so effectively, I think what the strategy was from the United States was to back the Sunni opposition in Syria and to sort of topple Assad, regardless of the cost, even if it means the emergence of a super radical Islamist faction in Syria.
Because I guess either way, they have these incidents or supposed incidents or whatever to say to have evidence against Assad to take him out no matter what. So,
right.
Yeah.
And yesterday we actually talked about Iraq. We sort of left off. I was talking about how our policies in Iraq empowered a group called the Islamic State of Iraq, or Al Qaeda of Iraq. And this is precisely this is the very same group that crossed over the border in Syria right around the beginning of the Syrian civil war. By 2014, ISIS really kind of had established its name, but it was already pretty much a movement and a thing well before that. And so when this DIA document is talking about this radical rebel movement in eastern Syria, that's effectively the same radical movement that we empowered in western Iraq. And western Iraq shares a border with eastern Syria along what's called the Sykes-Picot border. And so this is sort of what I'm trying to say here, is that American policies in Iraq really blew back in Syria, really created this radical opposition in Syria. And then we sort of doubled down by backing that opposition.
Wow, I mean, so Syria being right in between Iraq and Turkey, there's a huge situation with Turkey, right? Because there's a situation where, like we said before, the Kurds seceded, and let me see here. I guess that's much later, but Turkey actually bombs the Kurds later on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Turkey's had on and off problems with the Kurds, particularly a group called the Kurdistan Workers Party, or the PKK. And this is basically like a communist left-wing group in Turkey that Turkey calls a terrorist organization. But yeah, Turkey has had a large role in the Syrian conflict. For a long time, because Turkey's southern border is right along Syria's northern border. And so Turkey's southern border for a long time was basically a conduit into Syria for weapons and fighters and, money and stuff and resources. And in fact, I mentioned the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Very soon after that, in 2011, the Central Intelligence Agency began sending weapons out of Libyan arsenals through Turkey and into Syria in order to arm rebels. And so this is very early on in the Syrian conflict that this is already happening. And I mean, it goes very far back. The American view towards Syria, it's sort of their long-term goal. And so there's even a CIA document that's been declassified that goes back to 1986, where they're looking at sort of what would happen if there was a war in Syria between the Sunnis and the Shia, and who would we back? And they said, yeah, basically we would prefer if the Sunnis were in power in Syria. So all the way back in 1986, they're already talking about, they weren't necessarily planning for it to happen, but just sort of laying out the position of the United States that, yeah, we'd kind of rather business-friendly Sunni moderates take over there.
And as you said,
but I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you can finish that thought, and I'll have something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say the Sunni rebels who we ended up backing, they're not business-friendly moderates. These are hardcore religious wackos in a lot of cases.
And you messaged me earlier that the U.S. sees ISIS as the main enemy, but they're kind of allies with Turkey at the same time. So it creates like this weird tension. It's like no one really understands who's on whose side.
Yeah, it's really difficult with ISIS because you have such a contradictory policy. So getting to more recent times, and last summer, the United States was engaged in a huge bombing campaign against ISIS in their capital city of Raqqa in Syria. However, just years prior, we had been pouring tons of money and weapons and training into rebel groups that pretty much are like, it's not necessarily ISIS, but it's like Scott Horton says, some of these rebel groups are basically the arms procurement division of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So they pretend to be moderates, and they talk a good game about democracy and stuff, but they really end up just turning around and giving their weapons to groups like ISIS. And
exactly. This is exactly where we're going next. That in 2013 there was a program that trained the Syrian rebels, and also in 2013 when the first chemical weapons were supposedly used by Assad. So how does this all correlate?
Yeah, so as you said, I think the training program, the thing you're referring to, I think there was several training programs. There was a Pentagon one and a CIA one. And at some points, you even had Pentagon trained and backed rebels fighting CIA trained and backed rebels, just to illustrate the absurdity of this. But yeah, in 2013, there was allegations against Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, that he used chemical weapons against rebels in a place called Ghouta. And now Ghouta has been back in the news more recently. It's been a rebel hub for a long time. However, it was never proven that Assad did this, that Assad actually used these chemical weapons. What seemed to be more likely was that it was sort of a rebel staged false flag kind of thing. And I don't say that lightly. A great investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh really did great reporting on this in a piece called "The Red Line and the Rat Line."
We'll link to that.
And this gets into Obama's red line that he was supposed to, if Assad used weapons of mass destruction against his own people, that was the red line that would trigger our intervention. And so what seemed happened was that rebels heard that speech that Obama gave about the red line, and they wanted to cross that red line for Assad to trigger American intervention on behalf of the rebels. And as far as I can tell, that seems to be exactly what happened in 2013 there. And Obama didn't go through with bombing, fortunately. He kind of, I think one of his intelligence people, James Clapper, even interrupted a morning briefing and told him, this is not a slam dunk. And that's in reference to what George Tenet told George W. Bush. The CIA director told Bush about Iraq intelligence, that it's a slam dunk. Well, Clapper told Obama this whole Ghouta chemical weapons thing, that's not a slam dunk. And so he didn't do it, fortunately.
Now, we were referring to the Obama speech in September 2013 when, I guess the driving point is that, Obama's thought is like a peacetime president when really he was a heavy wartime president. If you just looking at just the numbers alone.
Yeah, so it's very mixed with Obama because you have, of course, this giant Afghan surge that put over 100,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. He sent, to some degree, got us back involved with Iraq. Trump kind of finished that. He overthrew Gaddafi in Libya through a NATO-led intervention. However, in this one incident in 2013, he actually refrained from bombing. And so I guess we can kind of be glad for that. He kind of showed restraint in that one incident because he just wasn't convinced about the intelligence about the chemical weapons thing, apparently.
But I guess years later, that same, not to jump too far forward, but in last spring, 2017, there's a supposed chemical weapons attack again. So I'm wondering if, the criticism or the applause received from the first time, the way it worked within the media and everything, it was an easy way to say it happened again. Now, it may have happened. We're not saying it didn't. It's just, there's some odd things going on here at the same time that would kind of contradict that. Why would Assad actually do that?
Right. There's a lot of reasons why it doesn't really add up. First of all, Assad at this point, you're talking about the April 7th, 2017, an attack in his town called Khan Sheikhoun. And yeah, there's really not a lot of, it doesn't really make a lot of sense why Assad would do this. He was largely winning the war. And using that type, they allege that he dropped a sarin nerve agent. It's an organophosphate nerve agent. And it doesn't even really make a lot of sense to do that. You could pretty much kill the same amount of people and wreak way more havoc with regular explosives. And so why he would use a chemical weapon randomly here doesn't make a lot of sense.
Can you think of any argument why that would make sense? I mean, was there any plausibility to it at all?
Well, one of the arguments is that why anyone would use chemical weapons is just to sort of terrorize and demoralize your opposition. And I guess that's always a plausible reason why someone in a war would use them. But I mean, chemical weapons like sarin is in a different category than chlorine. But there's been a lot of allegations that Assad has used chlorine gas too. But that doesn't really add up either. Chlorine is not a very good weapon. It's hard. Like, sure, it's a deadly chemical, but it's even in like World War I, commanders found that it didn't really work that well. It's just as likely to blow back and hurt you. You know.
It's used in swimming pools. I mean, yeah, it takes a large quantity, I'd imagine.
Right, and that's another thing about the chlorine allegations too, is that it's accessible everywhere. Chlorine is used as a antiseptic or whatever, a decontaminant for
so
water
supplies. It's plausible they would have had access to that.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And in the case of the 2017, the Khan Sheikhoun thing, there's another great journalist named I already mentioned Seymour Hersh in reference to the 2013 one. In 2017, he had another great report called what was it called? It was at a German newspaper called Die Welt. And it's funny because Seymour Hersh used to be a very mainstream New York Times reporter, but they stopped running him because he's too good on these questions. He's willing to question certain narratives. However, where was I at with the Khan Sheikhoun? Oh yeah, so it's a huge reason to be skeptical about the claims of Khan Sheikhoun, because the best evidence in support of the claim that Assad did it was an organization called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. And they work with the United Nations through a thing called the Joint Investigative Mechanism to investigate certain alleged uses of chemical weapons. However, their report, it even makes clear that the chain of custody for this evidence that they allege to have looked at, it passed through rebel hands. And so any piece of evidence that passes through rebel hands, you absolutely cannot trust. And it ended up being analyzed in Turkish laboratories too, which, as we've mentioned, Turkey has not been. It's not like they're Switzerland in this. They have an absolute incentive to push a certain line in the war. And so I think for those reasons alone, it's suspect.
So, I mean, February 2014, ISIS forms and becomes an enemy of al-Qaeda. This obviously leads up to September 14th when we bomb ISIS. What kind of happens in between that year and 2014?
Yeah, so 2014 is the year of the ISIS's giant blitzkrieg, where they took Mosul, they took a bunch of major cities, and they ended up with a swath of territory the size of Great Britain. And so this is what Obama originally called the JV team, the junior varsity team of al-Qaeda, which obviously was sort of mistaken. However, as I started saying earlier, we have a sort of a mixed relationship with al-Qaeda, because yes, we did indeed begin bombing ISIS, and we did actually, with the help of Kurds and other local forces, Kurds in Syria and local Arab forces in Iraq, we did push them out of major cities. However, as I mentioned, at the same time, we were arming and training these rebel factions that was going to indirectly bolster ISIS. And there's even an organization who they sometimes do good work called the Conflict Armament Research Institute or Agency, the CAR. And they found that most American and Western weapons that were being poured into the opposition, made their way into the hands of ISIS. And there's lots of other media reports that says this. And so it's kind of odd. There's sort of a mixed relationship. It seems like we pour weapons into their movement and into their allies. They end up with a lot of these weapons, but at the same time, we bomb them and we attack them and wage war against them. And so it's kind of a mixed thing there.
I mean, I think, especially someone so deep into like neoconservative ideology, it's really like a stab in the back to hear that we're propping up these regimes, these evil people. I mean, you don't want to believe it. I can imagine why people don't want to believe it.
Absolutely. And I think sort of, I guess if you wanted to take a more, I don't know if I call it conspiratorial approach, but I think sort of some of the thinking on this is that, fighting the Islamic State, it sort of keeps us involved in the region. And I think that's largely like ISIS is being sort of used as an excuse to keep an armed presence in Syria. Again,
like you're saying, we're training these Syrian rebels, and we're doing this in July 2015 to fight ISIS and not Assad. This seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, now I think a lot of I'm not sure if this. I know we had to restart. I'm not sure if this got captured, but I know that I think a lot of the fighting against ISIS has to do with just simply wanting to keep a presence in the region. Kind of having a reason to stick around, and so they bombed ISIS out of their major capital city of Raqqa last summer. but they've sort of, you'll see how they treat the sort of remnants of ISIS. They don't really go after them. They kind of let them retreat back and melt back into an insurgency. Because ISIS began, as we said, as an insurgency in Iraq, and it really became a state around 2014, or a statelet, or a group aspiring to be a state, when it took all this territory. And so we've sort of pushed them out of being a statelet back into being an insurgency.
Right, and just a month later, in August 2015, Turkey bombs the Kurds. So like we were talking about earlier, the U.S. ironically sees ISIS as the main enemy, but it allies with Turkey. So we kind of touched on this earlier, but how do we make sense of this? Because it just seems like a big contradiction again.
Yeah, let me bring in the Kurds now, because they're kind of like, I would say that trying to back, because you mentioned the Free Syrian Army earlier, and sort of the first phase of trying to back rebels in Syria was looking for moderate Sunni rebels. And the Free Syrian Army was presented as being like the bastion of those guys. But after several years of this war, it was pretty much like clear to everybody. Even Barack Obama said that the idea that there was going to be a viable moderate Sunni opposition was a fantasy. And so we sort of pivoted over to supporting the Kurdish factions. And I already mentioned the PKK. They have a sort of sister group in Syria called the YPG, the People's Protection Units. And that's who you're referring to when you said they sort of declared secession. It's sort of in a de facto way. It's not like they really formed their own explicit state. They had their own little region, a little enclave they called Rojava. And so that's sort of what, that's their project in around northern Syria there. And of course, that's right on the Turkish border, and Turkey doesn't like that. And so that's why we've seen them bombing the Kurds. And so, yeah, it's a very confusing thing. It's like Turkey has had some cooperation with ISIS with oil sales and stuff and arming and training. Turkey hates the Kurds, but the United States, is allies to the Kurds. At the same time, Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States. And so you can see how it just gets very confusing and complicated. It's a very, it's a cluster, you know?
Now, I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly. I'm literally remembering this from like 10th grade social studies, but the NATO agreement, like if you're part of the NATO agreement, if you bomb another country, like all the other countries can bomb you or something like that. It's like really, or is that the same one?
Article 5 of like the NATO's founding document, says that anybody who comes under attack and who's a NATO member, all the other members are pretty much obligated to render aid and assistance.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll never forget that, because you know that seems like some incentive to not start wars. But I guess we're gonna get into what happened with Russia striking. They were supposedly striking ISIS, but they ended up striking anti-Assad rebels.
Yeah, so I can also get into the Russian thing. So Russia had been giving Russia's sort of an ally to Bashar al-Assad. Russia's had a naval base in Tartus for a long time, and that's sort of their major interest. And now they've set up airfields all over the place in Syria, and air defense, missile defense and stuff. However, Russia really directly got involved in the Syrian conflict in 2015. And I would argue that's largely because of the Western and allied support for the rebels. Had that not happened, who knows if Russia's assistance would have even been needed. And the same thing goes for Iran. However, yeah, you mentioned that particularly in the liberation of Aleppo, there was a lot of claims that Russia wasn't going after ISIS and they were only going after anti-Assad rebels. But sort of as I've been saying, the anti-Assad rebels aren't moderates. A lot of them pretty much share an ideology with the Islamic State. And so, you know, you have Jabhat al-Nusra, which has changed its name now to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They're part of the rebels. They're certainly not moderate. You have a group called Harakat Nur ad-Din al-Zinki. They received American funding and training and stuff. They were caught on film beheading a young boy. I forget, I think 2015 or something. And so this is sort of the type of groups that make up the Syrian opposition. Groups like Ahrar al-Sham, you know, radical Islamic Sunni factions. And so when the media complains that, hey, you're not bombing ISIS, they're basically complaining that you're bombing al-Qaeda instead of ISIS, which is kind of a distinction without a difference.
Yeah, it makes no sense. Well, I guess one of the big topics here is Aleppo. And obviously remember poor Gary Johnson. What is Aleppo? Can you tell us what happened there? Because I think 2016 was really the year for that topic, or or Aleppo is the capital of Syria. Is that correct?
No, it's a large population center.
Damascus. Okay, gotcha.
But it's like it's one of the hubs in Syria for business and that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So,
okay.
Yeah, Aleppo was like a rebel hub, basically. It was one of their cities that they controlled. And so, yeah, what you're referring to is just it depends on what side you're on, I guess. If you're like from the Assad side, it's the liberation of Aleppo, getting rid of the rebel force. But of course, the way the Western media reports it is like the siege of Aleppo. It's this evil thing. However, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of people who, like, I think you sort of get an idea of what the situation was when you see the Syrian army freeing certain districts in Aleppo. You would see like crowds of people coming out to cheer them as liberators and stuff. because they had been held there. Like a lot of people who'd been held in rebel territory, they weren't allowed to leave, and they were under very strict, like they couldn't protest, they couldn't do anything. So the rebels had been very authoritarian in the past, and so yeah, effectively that's what was happening. Assad and Russia were trying to liberate Aleppo from these rebels. And now, certainly, again, I don't want to defend the Assad regime or the Russian bombing campaign. They kill a lot of civilians, and we should never lose sight of that kind of thing. Even sort of when the situation is being lied about by the press, we still shouldn't, justify the slaughter of civilians.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a terrible situation. And what part of 2016 did Aleppo really get going with this whole siege?
I couldn't tell you which month it was. I don't have.
I have written down here late 2016, so I didn't know if that was in the ballpark. Because yeah,
that sounds right to me. I think around 2016. And I think I may be mistaken about this. I think Assad ended up making some kind of reconciliation deal. He did that in Homs with a bunch of this has happened many times where Assad has sort of approached the rebels and said, "Look, give up your heavy weapons. You can leave with your small arms and just get out of here, and we'll try to reconcile this." And so certainly Assad doesn't seem to be, as many civilians as he's killed, he doesn't seem to be completely intransigent. He seems to be seeking some kind of reconciliation with the opposition.
Now, just to recap for people who are watching, the Sunnis support the rebels and the Shia support Assad. But maybe you could talk a little bit about Hezbollah, because they're a Lebanese militia backed by Iran, and they invade to fight along Assad.
Yeah, exactly. So Hezbollah, as you said, it's a Lebanese militia in southern Lebanon. They're also a Shia group. And the sort of demographics in Syria is the majority of the population are Sunni, and 11% are Alawite and 11% are Christian. The rest are other minority groups. And the Assad regime is Alawite. It's a form of Shia Islam. And so, countries like Iran and groups like allied groups such as Hezbollah have been participating in the war. And Hezbollah is not the only one. There's other Iranian militias participating in that conflict against the Sunnis. And now something to be said about Assad is that, yes, while he is a Shia, a lot of ethnic minorities, such as the Druze, not the Jews, the Druze, which is an ethnic minority in Syria, and other minorities, sort of see Assad as the protector of the ethnic factions. Because rebel groups like the Islamic State and other Sunni groups, they have slogans that say things like, the Shia to the sea and the Christians to Beirut, meaning we're going to expel everybody and kill all the Shia and stuff. And so you can see how, it wouldn't be a hard choice for an ethnic minority between the socialist dictator Assad and the, wacko Islamic guys. It's not a hard choice.
Now, just to contrast with a country like Afghanistan, who's mostly Sunni, you're saying that Syria is mostly Shia.
Well, Syria has a ruling Shia party, but their larger population is Sunni. And
they're Sunni as well. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So like we talked about last night, Iraq, they're mostly Shia. They're sort of an outlier in that they have a Shia majority. Syria sort of tracks along with most of the rest of the Muslim world in that they have a Sunni, I think it's 70% Sunni minority.
Now is Iran Shia as well?
Yeah, exactly. Iran,
Gotcha.
the Ayatollahs, Iran's a literal theocracy. They actually have a religious figure in charge, which is sort of different from somewhere like Syria, which is more secular.
Not to go off topic, can you talk about that a little bit? I have no knowledge of that.
Yeah, the Ayatollah, that's a religious designation as well as a political one. And so he's not just the Pope in that he's the head of a religious sect. He's also the Pope and the supreme. He's called the supreme leader. And so that's sort of how that's a literal theocracy in Iran. And they believe in a form. Go ahead.
Now, how does Sharia law, or Sharia law, however that's pronounced, relate to all this? Is that more prominent in Shia or Sunni or both? How does that relate to everything? Because obviously that's the main thing you hear is that, they want to impose Sharia law on everywhere.
Yeah, so it's kind of differs. So it's not so simple as to just break it down into Shia and Sunni. And so, for example, Iran, the theocracy, some of their stuff is going to be some of their law is going to be based off Sharia law. And a Sunni state like Saudi Arabia, they're very radical. They're not literally a theocracy. That's a royal family who doesn't have. It's not like the Sauds are actually religious figures. Some of them may be, but not the ones who are in charge. However, they have some Sharia law as part of their legal system. However, countries like Iraq and Syria, they've gone more of a secular nationalist socialist kind of way. And so perhaps some inspiration from Sharia law makes it in there, but no, they're mostly Syria's mostly, I think, a secular society.
Gotcha. Well, we've definitely discussed a lot. I mean, just to kind of recap, where are we at today with Syria? I mean, I mentioned in the introduction that, nearly half a million people have died. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it doesn't really appear that we're anywhere near being done with this, unfortunately. And so, yeah, the first phase was sort of backing Sunnis there, who we claimed to be moderates. We failed in doing that. So we turned around and backed the Kurds. All the while, we're trying to fight and bomb the Islamic State out of certain places while we arm their allies and stuff. And so that's sort of that's brought us to the current point where you have a U.S.-backed Kurdish force, and the former Secretary of State, who was just fired, Rex Tillerson, came out and said that we're going to try to back a 30,000-man force, a Kurdish-backed force, along the border. And so that's sort of what the United States is trying to do now. And actually, not to toot my own horn too much, but over the summer, I was actually reporting and sort of speculating that based on what I was seeing, it looked like the U.S. was going to try to do precisely that, to try to embed with the Kurds and have a reason to keep occupying Syria. Perhaps, maybe, this is just speculation, but maybe with the ultimate goal of partitioning the country, of splitting it into two. And so that may be what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, I guess only time will tell. Well, Will, it's always a pleasure to have you on. This definitely won't be the last time, but we're going to have Kyle on the next 2 days to talk about Yemen and Libya. And I think on Friday, we're kind of going to do a recap. And I don't know if we can maybe set this up. Maybe on Friday, we can have maybe you both on the chat. We'll see what happens. Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. We could just alternate and just talk a little bit and just have like a real recap, because people have loved this week. Out of all my weeks I've done, people have reached out and just been like, hey, like, really love the theme. And I've learned a lot of things that I've never even thought about, because, if you just go back and listen to the days we've done so far, we've covered a mountain of stuff. Even I've gone back and listened, but thanks again so much, Will. And we're going to link to a bunch of stuff that we mentioned throughout the episode. We're also going to mention to some of maybe you could pull up some of your recent writings on Syria, because obviously we're talking to you about Syria because you know a lot about it. And yeah, thanks so much, Will. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. I'll dig up some links for you, and I appreciate you having me.
All right, we'll talk to you later. Hey everyone, please like, follow, donate, subscribe, and share. Any donations will be used to reach more people.